under.
Testing, 1, 2. Okay. So we begin with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so today we continue now with the next sutta in our list. We're on our schedule. This is Sutta number 21. It's called the Simile of the saw, the Kakacupama Sutta. And the ending of the sutta is very well known and very often quoted when people are explaining about Buddhist practice of patience. And so as we'll see, that the main theme of this sutta is how to practice patience under difficult and trying conditions. Especially patience when people speak to you in ways which are aggressive, hostile, offensive, disrespectful, abusive, slanderous. Something that we all encounter many times these days, and so it's a lesson that we have to learn. Okay, so the sutta begins with the particular situation that had developed in the Sangha. It says, on this occasion, a monk named the Venerable Mollapaguna had been associating overmuch with bhikkhunis, that is, with Buddhist nuns. Okay, now it's a general principle that the Buddha allowed for the ordination of women as bhikkhunis, and so he had two divisions in the Sangha, the Bhikkhu Sangha, the community of monks, and the Bhikkhuni Sangha, the community of nuns. And in order to maintain the sense of proper decorum within the Sangha, it's a kind of guiding principle that the monks and nuns shouldn't associate too closely because probably there's a fear that quite natural fear that if they associate too closely, then what happens is, especially you have young men who are being ordained as monks, maybe they become ordained as novices when they're 16, 17 years old. They get their full ordination. They could be 20, 21 years old. They get the full ordination. And so now they're in their 20s, and then you have women getting ordained again as novices. They could be 16, 17 years old, then getting the full ordination when they're 20, 21. And so they're young people in their 20s, early 30s. If they associate too closely, especially one associating closely with the other, then it's just natural that feelings of, let's say, personal affection develop between them. And when feelings of personal affection become strong, then it leads into romantic love. And when feelings of romantic love develop, then the Buddha's discourses on meditation, boring. Buddha's discourses on insight, wisdom, boring. Buddha's discourses on supreme liberation, boring. But the mind is thinking of only one thing. When the monk hears the name of others talking about such and such bhikkhuni, then he's interested. When the other bhikkhunis are talking about such and such a monk, then she's interested. So that's human nature. And so in order to keep the monks and nuns sort of continuing along the track of the celibate life, it's a kind of guiding principle that they should keep a certain distance from one another. But there's a certain amount of interaction which takes place, because in the Buddha's time there were not printed texts of the Buddha's discourses, and so since the monks were living in close proximity to the Buddha, they would hear most of the Buddha's discourses, and they would then take on part of the responsibility of going to the quarters where the nuns are living and giving teachings to the nuns. And also, since the order of monks had been established before the order of nuns, then within the structure of the teaching, the order of monks functions somewhat like an elder brother to the order of nuns. And so they give instructions, guidance, advice to the nuns. But in order to ensure that that's done smoothly, usually when a monk is assigned to give teachings to the nuns, then he would be accompanied by another monk. So there would be at least two monks going together to the nuns' monastery. Okay, so this monk, Moliyapaguna, apparently was not observing this kind of principle of decorum, but he was probably associating too closely with the bhikkhunis, with the nuns, on a very personal basis. And so the text goes on and it says he was associating so closely with the bhikkhunis that if any bhikkhu spoke dispraise of those bhikkhunis when he was around, then he would become angry and upset. And then he would start blowing it up into a full-blown case. And if any other bhikkhu should speak dispraise of Venerable Moliyapaguna in the presence of those bhikkhunis, then they would become angry and displeased and would make a big case out of it. Okay, so when the bhikkhus are aware of what is going on, they come to the Buddha, and one of them reports to the Buddha what has been happening, and then the Buddha asks a monk to go to Moliyapaguna and call him. Tell him that the Buddha wants to speak to you. Okay, and so one monk goes to Moliyapaguna, tells him, and Moliyapaguna comes to the Buddha's presence. Now, paragraph 5, notice this is interesting. It shows you, first it shows you the procedure that the Buddha uses, and then this procedure serves as a kind of guideline for conducting affairs in the monastic order all the ways down to the present. And it should be observed not only in affairs of the monastic order, but in any kind of situation where one person or one group of people are lodging a complaint to you about another person, about the misconduct of another person. So when Paguna comes to the Buddha's presence, the Buddha doesn't begin at once saying, you should not behave like that, you should not do that. But the Buddha asks him first, is it true that you are associating very closely with the bhikkhunis? So much so that when any bhikkhu speaks dispraise of the bhikkhunis in your presence, you get angry. If somebody speaks dispraise of you in their presence, they get angry. Is that the case? So the Buddha first has to get the person who is accused to admit to the charge against him. He doesn't just accept the charge on its face value as being true, but he wants the person to admit to the fault himself. Okay, so Paguna says, yes, this is true. And then the Buddha gives him a sort of word of advice, paragraph 6. He says, it is not proper for you, a clansman gone forth out of faith from the home life into homelessness, to associate overmuch or too closely with the bhikkhunis. If anyone speaks, such that if anyone speaks dispraise of those bhikkhunis in your presence, okay, therefore if anyone speaks dispraise of those bhikkhunis in your presence, you should abandon any desires and any thoughts based on the household life. And herein you should train yourself thus. My mind will be unaffected, and I shall utter no evil words. Maybe that's a little too strong. I shall utter no wrong speech, might be better. Or no harsh words. I shall utter no harsh words. But I shall abide compassionate for his welfare with a mind of loving kindness, without inner hate. That is how you should train. Okay, now I think one has to know how to observe this principle correctly and not take it to an unwarranted extreme. Okay, suppose you have some friends, and then somebody comes to your presence and then starts speaking criticism of your friends. It doesn't mean that you should just sort of shake your head like this, say, whatever they say about my friends, that's okay, it's not going to affect me. If you think that they're wrong, you should certainly defend your friends from criticism. And if you think it's an issue that requires further investigation, then you should maybe ask them further questions, ask them whether they have any grounds for their charge. You might go to your friends and ask them whether the criticism that these other people are making is true. So it doesn't mean that one remains completely indifferent and just accepts the criticisms that others make about your friends at face value. The point is that one should not let what the Buddha here calls desires and thoughts, translated thoughts as intentions, desires and intentions based on the household life. Or we could put this more simply as worldly desires and motivations. Don't let them interfere with your judgment. So that because you have a preference for a certain person, you like a certain person, you immediately feel compelled to, you first get angry and then you feel immediately compelled to jump to their defense. But rather the first task, when you hear the criticism of those who are your friends, those that you have affection for, the first task is to keep the mind calm, in a state of equanimity. Don't let the mind get stirred to anger and then to a quick, unreflective response. But first you arouse loving kindness or even compassion for the person who is uttering these harsh words. Make the mind free from inner hate, and then you can discuss with this person further. If you feel that you should defend your friend, you can do so. If you want to ask further questions, you can do so. If you want to call your friend for inquiry and investigation, then you can take that approach. But don't immediately respond with anger and harshness towards the person. Okay, the way it continues, I have to confess first, I don't know whether I would be able to sustain this myself. If anyone gives those bhikkhunis a blow with his hand, a blow with a clod of maybe a stone or a clod of earth, clay, or with a stick or with a knife in your presence, you should abandon any desires and any thoughts based on the household life and train yourself thus. My mind will be unaffected. Well, I have to say, if anybody was hitting, whether fellow monks, fellow nuns, or innocent householders in my presence, with the hands, with a clod, with a stick, with a knife, I would rush to their defense. But I would try to do so with a calm mind and having compassion for the person who's attacking them. I don't think I would be able to just stand there and say, I will keep a mind of loving kindness towards him and let him do whatever he wants. Okay, so you train yourself thus, my mind will be unaffected. Okay, if anyone speaks dispraise in your presence, again you abandon any desires and thoughts based on the household life. Oh, I see, okay. If anyone speaks dispraise to you, criticizing you, then you should abandon any desires and motivations based on the household life. Then if anyone should give you a blow with the hand, with a clod, with a stick, with a knife, then you should abandon any desires and any thoughts based on the household life. And again, you train yourself, my mind will be unaffected, and I shall utter no evil words, I shall abide compassionate for his welfare, with a mind of loving kindness, without inner hate. Yeah, if people speak dispraise of me, I think I could take it. If they hit me with a clod, a stick, or a knife, I could take it. But if they hit others, whether I like the others or not, but if I see that they're innocent people, I would certainly rush to their defense. Okay, now the Buddha apparently changes the topic. It seems a little bit abrupt, the different track in which he leads the discourse. But the purpose is to show how in the past the monks were easy to train compared to the way they are now at the time the Buddha is speaking. Like this becomes a perennial subject within the Buddha's own time and throughout Buddha's history, that things were always better in the past, and as time goes on, the behavior of the monks or even of the whole Buddhist community gradually deteriorates until we reach the rife corruption, deterioration of the present age. Okay, so the Buddha says, there was an occasion in the past when the bhikkhus satisfied my mind, then at that time I addressed the bhikkhus and I said to them, I eat at a single session, just in one sitting, and by so doing I am free from illness and affliction, and I enjoy lightness, strength, and physical comfort. In other words, he's healthy, light in the body, and strong. So then the Buddha instructs the monks, he said, you too eat your food for the day just in one session, one meal a day at one sitting. And by so doing, you too will enjoy good health and strength. And then I had no need to keep on instructing those monks. I didn't have to repeat the advice again and again. I only had to remind them of my instructions, to call this to their attention, and immediately they would follow my advice. And so then this is like a chariot which is harnessed to thoroughbred horses, it's waiting at the crossroads, and then a skilled trainer of horses comes along, he mounts the chariot, takes the reins in the left hand, the goad in his right hand, and then he could drive out wherever he wants, by any road that he wants. The horses immediately follow his, the cues that he gives them with the reins and with the goad. So in the same way, the Buddha says, I didn't have to keep on advising these monks again and again. I only had to give them this one suggestion and they would immediately follow it. And so now the Buddha sort of broadens the scope of his instruction and he says, abandon what is unwholesome and devote yourselves to what is wholesome, to wholesome qualities. For that is how you will come to growth, to increase or development and fulfillment in this doctrine and discipline. Then he uses another simile. It's like a big solid tree grove. The solid tree, it's a kind of tree that grows in northern India. I don't know what the Indian version is like, but there's also a solid tree that grows in Sri Lanka, but I think it's a different species. Very big tree, growing very, very tall. Okay, a big solid tree grove near a village or town, and it's choked with castor oil weeds. And then some man comes on the scene who wants to help the solid trees to grow. And so he cuts down and he throws out the crooked saplings that rob the sap of the healthy shoots of the solid tree. And he would clean up the inside of the grove and he would tend the straight, well-formed saplings so that the solid tree grove later comes to growth, increase, and fulfillment. And so in the same way, one should abandon what is unwholesome. What is unwholesome is like the crooked, stunted solid tree saplings, and like the castor oil weeds. And then the wholesome states, those are like the straight, well-formed saplings. And so one cultivates the wholesome states within oneself, and then one comes to growth, increase, and fulfillment in this dharma and discipline. Okay, now the Buddha is going to bring the discourse back to the main theme with which he started, and that is controlling inner anger. And he does this by showing, you could say this by revealing how anger can have deep roots within the mind, which are not immediately apparent, but they only come to the surface when we are put in provocative situations. And so for this reason, just because one can maintain a somewhat serene, calm, and peaceful mind when you're in favorable conditions doesn't mean that you've overcome anger. Sometimes one has to test oneself, but maybe not too quickly, not too hastily, by putting oneself into stressful and provocative situations just to see to what extent the mind is developed in overcoming anger. And so the Buddha uses here a simile, or maybe we call this a parable, or a little story, to show how anger can arise under provocative situations, so that the anger that we don't think is there will come to the surface and reveal itself when we're subjected to certain stresses that we don't ordinarily encounter. So he's giving a story about a housewife. This would be like a house mistress, the master of a house in the same city of Savatthi. And she had a good reputation. Everybody thought she's gentle, meek, and peaceful. Her name was Mistress Videhika. And then this Mistress Videhika had a maid whose name was Kali, who's said to be clever, nimble, neat in her work. And then the maid Kali thought, my mistress, everybody thinks that my mistress is peaceful, gentle, calm, but is she really free from anger or not? Let me test her to see to what extent she's free from anger and to what extent she'll become angry. And so one day the maid, Kali, got up late. And so the mistress calls her, and it seems this is not a very polite way to address her. She says, "Hey, Kali." And then Kali replies, "What is it, madam?" And then the mistress says, "What's going on with you that you've gotten up late?" It could be that she's ill, feeling exhausted. And maybe in India at that time, with the very heavily stratified class society, even if one is ill, one is expected to get up early and start working. I heard somebody talking back. Okay, we could. Okay, so this Mistress Videhika asked Kali, "What is the matter that you got up so late?" And then Kali replies, "Nothing is the matter," which is kind of confrontational way of replying. So then the mistress says, "Nothing is the matter, you wicked girl, yet you get up so late." Then she became angry and displeased, and she scowled. Okay, so Kali is starting to realize that my mistress does have anger, even though she doesn't reveal it so easily. So now, the next day, she's going to test her mistress a little further. And so she gets up, the next day she gets up still later in the day. Again, the exchange goes on. "Why are you getting up so late?" And the maid says, "No reason, nothing is the matter." And now, this time, the mistress, Kali, became so angry that she started to speak angry words and to scold her servant. Again, Kali is realizing that my mistress has even more anger. The third day, Kali got up still later, and then the Mistress Videhika scolded her, and then when Kali replied, "Nothing is the matter," then the mistress Videhika took a rolling pin or some other big object and gave her a blow on the head and caused her head to become wounded and start to bleed. And so then the maid Kali, with the blood running from her cut head, ran through the neighborhood saying to the neighbors, "See, O ladies, this gentle lady's work. See the meek lady's work. See your peaceful lady's work. How can she get so angry that she gives me a blow in the head and causes me to be shedding blood?" And so when this happened, then everybody came to know the real nature of Mistress Videhika. Mistress Videhika is rough, she's violent, she's merciless. Okay, and so now the Buddha applies this example to the case of the monks. And this is a situation, I have to say, that I've seen many times in my life as a monk. Here at the beginning, some bhikkhu is extremely gentle, very meek, very peaceful, so long as disagreeable courses of speech, disagreeable words don't touch him. But it is when disagreeable words touch him that it can be understood whether that monk is really kind, gentle, and peaceful. I do not call a monk easy to admonish, who is easy to admonish and makes himself easy to admonish only for the sake of getting robes, food, a resting place, and medicinal requisites. Why is that? Because that monk is not easy to admonish and so on when he gets no robes, alms food, resting place, and medicinal requisites. Okay, but it's when a bhikkhu is easy to admonish and so on because he honors, respects, and reveres the Dhamma that I call him easy to admonish. And therefore you should train yourselves thus. We shall be easy to admonish and make ourselves easy to admonish because we honor, respect, and revere the Dhamma. That is how you should train, O monks. What I've witnessed many times is that especially when I was in Sri Lanka, there come young Westerners who become ordained as monks, and when they're just very newly ordained, they seem very humble, very meek, very gentle, very polite, very respectful, but after 6 months, 1 year being a monk, then they think that they're very learned, very experienced, that they're now veteran monks, and then they become sometimes quite arrogant, very rude, very sometimes aggressive, and then you could tell that their politeness, their gentleness, their meekness, I wouldn't say that it's done disingenuously with the aim of getting some kind of personal benefits for themselves. Often it's simply because they're in a completely new environment, in a new situation, and so they're trying to fit in, to find their little niche. And so being gentle, humble, polite, and respectful at the beginning is a way to earn the affection of others. But once they find their place, say within a monastery, then they can become sometimes even aggressive and rude to monks who have been ordained for 10, 15, 20 years. I remember one young German monk who was like that back in the early 1990s. He would find faults with things that one monk would say, then he would go to another monastery and start reporting those faults to other monks there, trying to create conflicts between monks in different monasteries. And usually what happens almost invariably to them is after 2 or 3 years, they vanish. Okay, now the Buddha comes to what is the main theme of this discourse, which he's going to repeat over and over, each time illustrating it with a different simile. And it's one of the things that always strikes me very much about the Buddha's suttas or discourses, is the way almost every important point is illustrated by a simile which helps to, a simile or a parable, which helps to lodge that doctrinal point deeply within the mind. It's amazing how the Buddha can draw these similes from so many different aspects of human life. They say that he lived locked up in the palace for the first 29 years of his life. But how does he know the way elephant trainers train elephants, the way horse trainers train the horses, the way goldsmiths prepare some gold ore to make gold ornaments? And here we have a variety of similes. Okay, so first comes the main point of advice. There are these 5 courses of speech, 5 ways of speech that others may use when they address you. Okay, their speech may be timely or untimely, that is spoken at the proper time or at an improper time. For example, improper time, somebody wants to criticize your behavior, to point out you've been doing something wrong, even though he might have a valid criticism. So maybe you're sitting around with your friends, chatting at a table in the dining hall. Then he comes over, he sits down in the midst of your group, and then he said that, when you were in the shrine room and everybody else was bowing, you were just standing there yawning. Why were you doing that? And then it's not the proper time. If you want to criticize the person, you wait till you can find that person alone and speak to them privately, where you don't embarrass them in front of a group. Okay, so their speech might be timely or untimely. It might be true or untrue. They might be criticizing you for something which is true, which you've rarely done, or for something which is false, something that they've just heard about by hearsay. And so what you do, if somebody tells you that so-and-so has been doing something wrong, and you want to speak to that other person about their wrong deed, then you don't call that person to your presence and then start to reproach them for what you've heard from the third person. But you follow the way that the Buddha used when he called Moliyapaguna to him. You call the person and you ask that person whether you have done such and such. It could be that the person is not willing to admit that he's done something wrong. Maybe somebody comes to you and says that he saw his friend Sam, maybe in a bookshop, take a book from the shelf and stick it within his jacket and then walk out without paying for it. And so you call Sam to your presence. You say, "Is it true, Sam, that you've done this?" And Sam says, "No, I didn't do that." But Sam is really lying about this. And maybe you can suspect from his facial gestures, the way he replies, maybe a little nervously, you suspect that he's lying. And so it doesn't mean that because he denies it that you have to accept his word at face value. You might probe on a little more deeply to get him to admit it. And if he won't admit it, then you might even call the other person to your presence and speak to both of them together and try to get the other person to make that accusation and try to find some way to resolve the conflict. And sometimes even something that one has either seen oneself or inferred can be misleading or mistaken. I recall something that happened to me in Sri Lanka some years ago. This would be, I think, 1995. I used to have, well, I don't have it anymore since I'm not living there, but in the place where I was living in Sri Lanka, I had a shortwave radio, which I would listen to in the evening to get the BBC World Service News. Okay, and there was this young boy from the village. From time to time, he used to come to the monastery just to see the monks. A little boy from a poor family. And so this was the day before the Buddha's birthday, before Vesak. He came to pay respects to us. Okay, then the next day, I had been invited out to go to some friend's house for lunch, and I looked for my glasses, and I couldn't find them. I looked all over the building, every place where I put the glasses, I couldn't find them. And when was the last time that I used the glasses? It would have been the previous evening when I went out for a walk, which would have been about 5:30, come back about 6, and that boy came about 6 o'clock. Couldn't find the glasses. He's a poor boy. So the inference was, even though it was such a terrible thought, that boy has stolen the glasses. And so later the next day, I sent somebody to the village to call that boy. And since he just spoke a little bit of English, and I just spoke a little bit of Sinhala, so I had to call the Sinhalese monk who was living at the monastery to translate. And so I called that boy, the three of us were together, and I said to that boy, that was a very terrible thing that you did last night. You came to the monastery, and when I wasn't looking, you took my eyeglasses. Why did you do that? Then the boy said, "No, I didn't take the glasses." And then I said, "Well, there was nobody else in the building but me and you, and I looked everywhere for the glasses. I couldn't find them. You must have taken them. Please return them." And the boy broke down crying. And when he started to cry, I realized he was telling the truth, and then I almost started to cry. And I patted him on the back and said, don't worry. No. Okay, I believe you. Okay, then sent him home. Then every day after I finished listening to the BBC evening news, I disconnect the radio and I put it in a particular spot. So that evening, I went to the spot where I keep the radio to get it to hook up to listen to the BBC news, and I pull the radio with the wire, and what is entangled in the wire? The glasses are there. So there I was so sure, as a matter of inference, I was pondering this for hours. I didn't want to accuse the boy, but the only conclusion I could come to was that he had taken them. But all the time they were in the radio, or in the wire of the radio. Okay, so true or untrue, gently or harshly. Sometimes people speak to you, even though they might be accusing you of something, but they'll speak gently. Sometimes other people will speak harshly, angrily, roughly to you. Sometimes they'll speak connected with good, in other words, with the intention of benefiting you, or with the intention of harm, intending to harm you. And sometimes they'll speak with the mind of loving kindness, sometimes with inner hate. Okay, so the Buddha then says, actually he's pretty much repeating what he said, but when others address you, their speech may be timely or untimely and so on. Their speech may be spoken with a mind of loving kindness or with inner hate. But here is the point: you should train yourself thus. Our minds will remain unaffected, unshaken, and we will utter no harsh words as a rejoinder. We shall abide compassionate towards them, with a mind of loving kindness, without inner hate. Okay, so that is the way one sets up one's mind. And now the Buddha explains how one uses this situation as an opportunity for developing loving kindness towards that person, and then spreading out from that person, one extends the loving kindness throughout the whole world. Okay, so we shall dwell pervading that person with a mind imbued with loving kindness, and starting with that person, we shall pervade the entire world with a mind of loving kindness, abundant, exalted, immeasurable, without hostility and without ill will. So that is how one should train. So first, one takes the person who is speaking to you roughly, harshly, falsely, with the intention of harming you, with inner hate, whatever. And one directs loving kindness towards that person. May that person be well, may that person be happy. One could think about the bad consequences that person is creating for himself because of accusing me wrongly with bad intentions, because of his anger, because of his harmful intentions. This person is creating the seeds of unwholesome karma that will bring suffering for them in the future. Or I know this person speaks to others like this, and so this person is creating many enemies. Few people like this person. He's regarded with suspicion, hostility by others. Nobody wants to become friends with him. And this person is just creating a lot of trouble for himself. So in this way one develops loving kindness and compassion towards that person, wishing for them to be well, to be happy, to be free from suffering. Then one extends that loving kindness. Once one can develop or direct the loving kindness towards this person, then one spreads out the loving kindness till it embraces everybody in the world. All those, one might start with all those who are the victims of calumny, just like yourself. All those being attacked verbally, all those being slandered, all those being dominated and attacked verbally by others. And so one develops loving kindness, compassion towards them. Then one can develop loving kindness and compassion to all of the victims of harsh speech. And then from there one could just extend loving kindness and compassion towards everybody in the world. Okay, now to illustrate how the quality of mind that one has to develop this mind which cannot be shaken, cannot be moved, cannot be budged from the attitude of loving kindness and compassion, the Buddha gives the simile of a man who comes along with a hoe and a basket, and he says, or he thinks to himself, I am going to make this great earth to be without earth. That is, using the shovel, he's going to, by shoveling up the ground, he's going to remove all of the soil from the earth. And so he would start digging in one place or another, strewing the soil here and there, spitting here and there, urinating here and there, thinking, may the earth be without earth, or may the earth be without any soil, may the earth be without any soil. And so the Buddha says, he asks the monks, what do you think? Could this man remove all of the soil from the great earth? And then the monks say, no, Bhante. Why is that? Because the earth is deep and immeasurable. It's not easy. In other words, it's impossible to make the great earth be without earth. Eventually, this man would only become tired, weary, disappointed from all of his useless efforts. And so the Buddha, he doesn't apply the simile point by point, but he just repeats the same thing and says, in the same way, you should develop this mind which remains unaffected, and then you extend loving kindness to everyone in the world. But the point is that just as this man, by digging the soil, can't remove the soil from the earth, so when you're devoted to the practice of loving kindness, when somebody speaks to you with harsh, angry words, with false accusations, intending to harm you, speaking with anger and hate within, he can't remove that loving kindness and compassion from the mind. Can't cause the mind to turn around and become angry, vengeful, vindictive, and bitter. But you will always maintain that mind of loving kindness, compassion, and equanimity towards this person. Okay, the next simile, paragraph 14. Here a man comes with a palette of paints of different color, crimson, turmeric, it's a kind of mustard color, indigo or carmine. Indigo is kind of blue, dark blue. Carmine, and he says, I'm going to draw pictures and make pictures appear on empty space. He doesn't have a canvas, doesn't have any paper, doesn't have a mural, a wall, but he just takes his palette of paints and sees a nice scene, nice landscape, and starts painting away on empty space. So what do you think, O monks? Could that man draw pictures and make pictures appear on empty space? And the monks say, no, Bhante. Why is that? Because empty space is formless and non-manifestive. That is, it doesn't manifest anything. It isn't easy to draw pictures or make pictures appear on empty space. Actually, it's impossible to make pictures appear on empty space. Unless one has maybe some kind of siddhis, supernormal powers. So eventually the man would reap only weariness and disappointment. So the man trying to paint pictures in empty space, this would be like the person who comes along and tries to provoke you to anger with false accusations, with harsh speech, with angry words, with the intention of harming you. And so your mind should be like empty space. Even though the harsh words are directed at your mind, but your mind doesn't display any outbursts, inner outbursts of anger or hatred, and no outward outbursts of angry and harsh words. So you should abide, the Buddha says, with a mind similar to empty space, abundant, exalted, immeasurable, without hostility, without ill will. That is how you should train. Okay, now comes the third simile. And this is, a man comes along with a blazing grass torch and says, I shall heat up and burn away the river Ganges with this blazing grass torch. What do you think? Can that man heat up and burn away the river Ganges with the blazing grass torch? And the monks say, no, Bhante. Why is that? Because the river Ganges is deep and immense. It isn't easy, in fact it's impossible, to heat it up or burn it away with a blazing grass torch. Eventually the man would reap only weariness and disappointment. So it was with the river Ganges in the Buddha's day. Nowadays, with the river Ganges around Calcutta, the mouth of the river Ganges, I'm not so sure. If one comes along with a blazing torch and puts that torch to the river Ganges by Calcutta, certainly it won't make the river Ganges disappear, but it could well make the river Ganges blaze up into a massive ball of flame. And not only the river Ganges, I saw on a news report a couple of weeks ago, you know this practice called fracking? It's a practice by which natural gas companies try to extract natural gas from the earth by pumping the earth with certain types of organic gases at very, very high density, so it will cause the earth, places in the earth where the natural gas is stored, to break apart, and then the natural gas will become accessible, and then they could drain out the natural gas and direct it through pipes into, what do they call this? Tanks where they store it. And so what happens is, what they do is to go into even communities where they know that the natural gases can be found on the ground, and they practice this fracking. And as a result, this fracking, the high density organic gases that they pump into the ground can seep through the ground to the supply, to the water supply, to reservoirs, to lakes, to streams, and enter into that water supply so that it comes through the drinking water that supplies that community. And so in the news report that I saw, a man was illustrating to the reporter how their water supply had been infected by these high-density organic gases, organic substances. He turned on the tap, and the water came running out of the tap, and then after it came running for about 1 minute, he took a cigarette lighter, lit the cigarette lighter, and put it to the tap water, and then the tap water burst into flame. And this is going on in many places in this country now. Okay, but anyway, during the Buddha's day, water was still water. And so with the blazing grass torch, it wouldn't have been easy to burn it up and make it blaze and burn away. And so then the Buddha applies the simile and says, in the same way, when others speak to you with harsh, angry words, false accusations, intending to harm you. You should dwell, pervading that person with a mind of loving kindness, then spread the loving kindness throughout the world. And so you should abide, pervading the whole world with a mind similar to the river Ganges, abundant, exalted, immeasurable, without hostility, without ill will. Then comes the fourth simile. This one is a little peculiar. I don't quite really understand what's going on. Okay, suppose there were a catskin bag. It's hard to conceive of people killing cats to get the skin to use for a bag. Maybe this is just the name that they use for this type of bag. It's rubbed, thoroughly well rubbed, soft, silky, rid of rustling, rid of crackling. And then a man comes along with a stick or a potsherd thinking, I'm going to make this catskin bag rustle and crackle. Maybe that would be the sign of a badly matured catskin bag if it rustles and crackles. Maybe it was considered like prestige item, like having a Gucci bag, or what are some of the other companies? Coach.
Coach is a company that makes 5 living things.
Yeah, they're very expensive.
Coach? Okay, Coach. Pyramid. The Gap, is that considered? No, that's just, those are jeans. Cheap stuff. President of Gap listens to my talks over the
Actually, Gap is known for child labor.
Oh, yeah.
They're manufactured in my country, so I...
Oh, is that so?
One notice.
Yeah. Okay, so if this man comes along, tries to make the catskin bag crackle, he can't make it crackle because the catskin bag has been well rubbed, thoroughly rubbed, it's soft, silky, and so on. And so the man will only reap weariness and disappointment. And so then the Buddha brings out the point, in the same way, if others address you in timely or untimely ways, true or falsely, gently or harshly, connected with good or with harm, spoken with a mind of loving kindness or with inner hate, again you should train yourselves. Our minds will remain unaffected and so on, without inner hate. And then you should develop this all-pervasive mind of loving kindness, similar to a catskin bag. Abundant, exalted, immeasurable, without hostility, without ill will. And then comes the example that gives the title to the discourse, and this is the sort of high point of patience, tolerance, imperturbability, and the development of loving kindness. Even if bandits were to sever you savagely, limb by limb, with a 2-handled saw, that's the saw has a handle on either end, so they take you, tie you up from between 2 trees, and then they take the saw and they start sawing away your limbs one by one. One who gave rise to a mind of hate towards them would not be carrying out or fulfilling my teaching. But even in that situation, you should train yourselves thus. Our minds will remain unaffected, and we shall utter no evil words. We shall abide compassionate for their welfare, with a mind of loving kindness, without inner hate. We shall abide pervading them with a mind imbued with loving kindness, and starting with them, we shall dwell pervading the whole world with a mind imbued with loving kindness, abundant, exalted, immeasurable, without hostility and without ill will. That is how you should train, O monks. Does anybody think they could fulfill that? Somebody starts sawing you one limb after another. Can you keep without any anger, without any ill will?
What I think is important is he's saying this is how you should train, not you should be able to do that right now.
Wonderful point. Wonderful point. That's a way, that's a kind of ideal that one should aspire to. It doesn't mean that we're all at that state already. I know I'm not at that state. Yeah, my one testing along this line, I've never been sawed apart, or never beaten. But again, this goes back to the time when I was living in the forest hermitage in Sri Lanka. I was staying with the older German monk, Venerable Nyanaponika. This could have been 92, 93. And he, because he was at that time in his 90s, he was already 91, 92, and his hearing was weak. And so somebody from America had brought for him a device that looked something like this, with earphones that one plugs in, and earphones, and then one gives this device, this part, to the person who's speaking to him, and they will speak into this, and he could hear easily, rather than he found it inconvenient to use the hearing aid, because it always has to be subtly adjusted. But with this kind of device, the other person is responsible for the controls. The old monk, Nyanaponika, he just has to put the headphones on. And so we used to leave it on the table in the front room when he wasn't using it. And so one day, when he was resting in his room, some young boys came into the forest, and they knocked on the door, and they said, I opened the door, and they said, we've been walking through the forest, we're thirsty, can we have some water to drink? So I said, okay, wait a moment, I'll get some water for you. So I went back into the kitchen to get a cup of water for the boys. I came walking back into the front room. The boys were gone. Then immediately my eyes went to the table, and the hearing aid was gone, that hearing device. And I realized that once they thought it was a radio, a kind of transistor radio, and they took it to keep it or to sell it. And immediately I became very angry. But not because it was my device. Maybe if it was my device, I would have taken it with equanimity. But because it was my teacher's device, did I say advice? Not because it was my device, but it was my teacher's device. Then I became really angry, and 1992, I was 48 years old, and here was a 48-year-old man chasing after a bunch of 14-year-old boys through the forest. They eluded me. But eventually we got them. I think I went to the police station, reported it to the police, and somehow the police tracked them down. I don't remember how. But we got it back. And I went to the police station, I saw those boys. When I saw them, I wasn't angry with them, but I gave them some advice that they shouldn't do this and to steal things from monks. Especially, I asked them, what is your religion? They said, we're Buddhist. To steal things from monks or a monastery, very dangerous. Do you realize what kind of karma you're creating? Okay, so but this is a very good point you made, that this is advice for training. It doesn't mean that we're already at that level, but we have to train ourselves step by step to reach that. Then the Buddha says, if you keep this advice on the simile of the sower constantly in mind, you see, that's the simile that the Buddha is giving for us to remind ourselves. Do you see any kind of speech, trivial or gross, that you could not endure? And so the monks say, no, Venerable Sir. And so then the Buddha says, therefore you should keep this advice on the simile of the sower constantly in mind. That will lead to your welfare and happiness for a long time. There's another interesting point coming out of a simile. Can anybody get what it might be? Just look at paragraph 21, the sentence, if you keep this advice on the simile of the sower constantly in mind, do you see any course of speech, trivial or gross, that you could not endure?
It's very like mastery of the mind in the last sutta that we studied last week.
Yeah.
It's a different practice that seems to aim at the same result.
Yeah. But there's something else that I had specifically in mind that just occurred to me when I read that sentence.
It would make anything you're enduring trivial compared to the being sought.
In fact, that just expresses in a different way the point that I had in mind. The simile deals with a case where somebody is actually sawing your body apart, limb by limb. But it's applied, the Buddha isn't saying, therefore, monks, you should be able to keep your mind in the state of loving kindness even when others saw you apart, limb by limb. But he's taking it to a more tolerable situation, at least as a starting point for training. Therefore, you should be able to endure any course of speech. So, when you apply the simile of the mind, when you apply the simile of the soul in one's mind, then one thinks, when others are speaking to you in angry, harsh ways, you think, the Buddha said that if bandits were to saw us apart, or to saw me apart limb by limb, I should be able to endure it. So what to me are these harsh words? It's a little bit like when we were children, we used to have this verse, sticks and stones might break my bones, but words can never harm me. Actually, words can do a lot of harm. But one uses this as a kind of guideline for training or practice. Okay, so this takes us through the simile of the soul. Any questions that come out from this? These are from the internet. Okay, one question. Jesus also taught turn the other cheek in the Sermon of the Plains, the Sermon of the Mount. Instead of turning the other cheek, isn't it better to just run away? Also, isn't it better to run away from from the bandits with the two-handled sword? First of all, I think Jesus' advice about turning the other cheek, I don't think that should be taken literally. It doesn't mean literally that if somebody hits you, you just function like a masochist and say, yeah, that felt good, but don't do it on that cheek, do it on the other cheek. So you have to interpret that piece of advice according to the intention, not take it literally. The point, I think, is not to take revenge on the person who hits you on one cheek, but instead regard them with compassion and maybe even do a good turn to them as a way of sort of breaking down their hatred or hostility. And then the question, isn't it better to run away from the bandits? Of course, it's better to run away from them, but I think the simile is presupposing that as you were running away, you slipped on a little track of muddy ground, and the bandits have caught you and tied you up, and they're cutting you to pieces, and so you can't get away from them. Okay, the other question is just a matter of translation. I won't say the whole question, I'll just give the answer. Yes, the two phrases in the Majjhima Nikaya and in the Anguttara Sutta are the same in Pali, it's just being translated in different ways. Do you have a question?
Two questions, and appreciate your comments on either or both.
Okay.
Several times the phrase based on the household life. And here we are, householders, and I wonder if that is, I wonder about it, because it seems to imply that we as householders need not or do not attempt to follow the same training in our own way. The other question is the one about Kali, the maid whose intentions are may seem as strange. I mean, she's taunting.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with you about that. I don't like to criticize a simile or a story given by the Buddha, but it seems it's a little extreme that the maid is deliberately violating her duties just to test her mistress, and properly she shouldn't behave in that way. I'll come back to the other question. Did you have some comment on that point?
No, I was just going to say that was well brought up, because every time I read the Sutta, I get very angry, especially at that little parable. Because Kali's a pervert. Well, they didn't hear me. She's a pervert. I mean, to do that, to deliberately tweak somebody, that's some bad...
Yeah, I have to agree with that, yeah.
And she deserved a cloud on the head. Just my opinion.
I have to say the cloud on the head is a little strong, but if it injures her physically, that goes to an extreme. But if she just answers, what is it to you, madam? I've just decided to get up late today. I mean, she's not fulfilling her responsibility as an employee in the household.
Yeah, but the simile is that we should not assault someone, even though she's violating.
We take the...
You see, even though she's violating her duty, we have no right to hit her. So therefore, it makes it worse or better. In other words, she could have just said, look, I'm sorry, maybe you made me sick, I need more time. Maybe you need a week of rest. Maybe you need to take off a little bit so that you could rest. So therefore you could work with compassion, and therefore, I've done this in many cases with employees where I used to do it where they come in and they couldn't make one day. I'll say, listen, take the day off next day. And say, no, I'm coming tomorrow. No, just take off. And I make them take off. That person will take off and it will work. Because I will give them a few days. And therefore they will come back and say, but I'm going to lose money. Well, that's okay, because they will rest. They come back, and next time they come on time. So therefore, I work with this person so that instead of hurting them, I hurt them in the pocket where it hurts. So she couldn't understand it with her. Say, listen, you could take off, and you don't get paid for your rest. And she will come back and eventually say, well, she has good temper. She works perfectly the way you should work around people. That's what he's trying to say. Yeah. But of course, either way you put it, of course she did something that was intentional because she was testing it.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we don't have to insist on taking the simile to imply that the Buddha is approving of that way of testing one's employer. It's just the simile to bring out the point that sometimes somebody can have an apparently meek, gentle, humble exterior, but inside they're still harboring anger. Okay, coming back to the first question. I have to say, within, say, the context of household life, again, like if one is training according to the Buddha's teaching, one should be training, not to get angry, say, if somebody speaks badly about one's wife, one's husband, one's children. Ideally, one shouldn't get angry, but naturally one feels a certain degree of worldly affection for them. So, certainly one should come to their defense, unless one agrees with the criticism. But it seems to be just an expression that was used, and more we might translate it, gehan nisitan. It's literally depending upon the house, or depending upon the home. Connected with the house, connected with the home. So it's referring more to the kind of ways of reacting that will go on in ordinary household life. It doesn't mean that somebody who's a householder but a follower of the Buddha's teaching shouldn't also be trying to train in this way. But at the same time, I would say one should recognize that because of the affection that arises from family relationships, sometimes the responses will be more difficult to modify and control than it would be to other people. Well, I have to say, it doesn't happen only amongst householders, but in the monastery, sometimes if one has, you have a teacher, a preceptor or a teacher, and then you're with some other monks, and they speak critically about your teacher, then naturally you get upset and angry with them. Like I used to hear about the well-known American monk Ajahn Sumedho. People would say that he never gets angry under any circumstances except if others criticize Ajahn Chah, his teacher.
You were reading my mind because I was thinking of Ajahn Sumedho when he was speaking when he was younger. He was a relatively young monk. He's like, well, he's just about the best teacher there is. You can cut. And he would get really angry.
Yeah.
He wouldn't say it. He just wanted to kill them. He'd say anything against him.
I do have, I think it's interesting, the other similes. The Buddha says that the other person will reap just weariness and disappointment.
Yeah.
In a certain way, this is a very effective defense. I find as a householder and in watching international affairs, like as a wife and mother, if I don't get angry when I'm provoked, if my child is very anxious, my husband gets very anxious, they will try to goad me into an argument. But if I do not get angry,
your husband
I'm
is
sort of like a martial arts master, and either the argument will dissipate, or something will change. But I have to keep grounded, keep stable, and not let them make me lose my balance. And I noticed, like when I watched the news, like when Vice President Biden was in Israel and was surprised with this terrible news, I could see how angry he was, and what a struggle it was for him to maintain his dignity. But when I read this, we're letting the other person, the opponent, read weariness and disappointment. It's also a very effective way of defending yourself.
In fact, last week I told you about the method that I used when I was taking walks in West Hempstead, Long Island, when the cars go by, and somebody shouts something insulting out the window of the car as it goes by. Why don't you dress like a human being? Why don't you put on some slacks and a shirt? What are you, a freak or something? If I look up, then they win. But if I just keep on focusing on my feet, continue to look down, then they reap weariness and frustration, in a sense. Okay, I think we'll have to end now the discussion now, but we'll continue after lunch we'll come back for a little while. So if you have other points you want to discuss, then please return after lunch. Next week is the 20th. I won't have the class next week. The 27th, what I've decided to do, there'll be a retreat going on, and I want to enter that retreat, but the morning of the 27th I'll hold a class. Otherwise, because 2 weeks after that I won't be able to have the class. Then it will be too long a gap. So the 27th I'll hold the class, but because the Kuan Yin Hall will be used for the retreat, we'll have the class in the Wu Wu library. The library, just as you're coming into the monastery. So please remember to go to the library next week. I'm sorry, March 27th. The 27th. And when the reminder goes out, I'll have Kaiti mention that in the reminder. Okay, we end with the verses to share the merits. Yeah, I found one thing that makes me angry. It's not even another person speaking. Not even sawing my lips. Akasata chabumata devanaga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabumata devanaga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabumata Devanaga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Mang Parang Etavatacha Hehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Devanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Sabbe Bhutanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Sabbe Satanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Pavagupadhaya vichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha sanya sanyino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibbutting. Okay, please stand.